On behalf of Academia Europaea, KU Leuven Libraries, and the Young Academy of Europe, it is my pleasure to welcome you all to this event. Open access has been a great success. An increasing number of scientific and scholarly journals are now either fully open access or are mainly publishing articles that are open access. But there is obviously a problem about the so-called article processing charges, which for some high-impact journals are quite exorbitant, in some cases more than $10,000 for a single article. And that means, of course, that for many people, it may be very nice that they can read all the papers in their fields, or at least the vast majority of them, but they may often be in a situation where they can't actually afford to publish in these journals. So the Diamond Open Access model sounds attractive in the sense that there should be no article processing charges. However, in certain fields, and certainly in my own field, which is the biomedical and life sciences, Diamond Open Access journals are virtually unknown. So we need to understand more about it, and particularly how more journals could go down that route. There's also a degree of confusion about terminology. The Diamond Open Access model is known, but there are also people who talk about platinum open access journals. And so some people ask, are these the same, or are there some subtle differences between them? All of this, I would hope, will become clear during this webinar. Happily, we have a number of experts with us here who will help us both clarify what actually is on the cards at the moment, and maybe even more importantly, how things could develop. So we have the Executive Director of Coalition S, Professor Johann Rohrick, who is a member of Academia Europaea, who will start out and talk about the recent developments in open access. Then we have Dr. Brecht Zanen, Senior Policy Officer for Open Science, Science Europe, talking about how to turn this vision into reality. Then we have Professor Sarah de Rijke, Professor and Scientific Director of the Center for Science and Technology Studies at Leiden University, on Diamond Open Access in the context of changing research cultures. We have Professor Demi Verbeke, Professor and Head of KU Leuven Libraries, on the role of libraries in supporting Diamond. And we have finally, but certainly not least, Professor Thomas Susi from the University of Vienna, and member of the Scientific Advisory Board for Open Research Europe on Diamond Open Access in Practice. So without any further ado, I will stop sharing my screen. You will notice that you can put your questions into the Q&A box, and we will have a discussion after we have run through these presentations. So I will now, without any further ado, call on Professor Johann Rohrick to give his talk. So Johann,
thank you.
The word is yours.
I'll give my talk about Brecht, start sharing the screens, because we have a joint presentation. Thank you, Brecht. So I will start with a brief introduction to Diamond Open Access, and we will talk. I will first talk about defining Diamond Open Access, just to make sure. Well, you already said there's also a platinum. I think we have chosen the term Diamond Open Access because it has gained slightly more traction in the last few years, I believe. So that's why we chose Diamond. So as you already said, it's a scholarly publication model in which journals and platforms do not charge fees to either author or readers. And that has a number of consequences. For instance, it is equitable by nature and design. Authors and readers everywhere have access to publishing and reading, regardless of their funding and or income. That is very important in the context of APCs. Most often, these journals are community-driven, academic-led and owned, so they are not commercial initiatives. That's very important to stress. And they serve a fine-grained variety of generally small-scale, multilingual and multicultural scholarly communities, testifying to bibliodiversity. They're also quite isolated, and I think this is what each in their own fields, each in their own regions. They do not have, of course, the marketing possibilities that commercial publishers have, and that is why they are relatively invisible. I will talk about that in a moment. Next slide, please. So as you know, Coalition S started in 2018, and from the beginning, Coalition S was criticized quite heavily for focusing on transformative agreements and gold open access. I think since we have changed a little bit, we have also now focused on the green open access with our policy on the rights retention strategy. And in March 2021, we came out with a study that was commissioned the year before, a study on diamond open access publishing, because as you probably know, we look at, as Coalition S, we look at all ways of publishing in open access, whether it be by transformative agreements, gold, green, polka-dot open access. We really don't care the color of open access as long as it is open access. But of course, diamond open access has a number of very interesting properties, especially in terms of the equity that it provides for researchers and the fact that it is non-commercial. So we launched this, we got this study, we received this study in 2001 with findings, recommendations, and a data set. It was a study led by OPERAS, with the number of partners that you can see on the screen. And there were a number of findings that were quite interesting. Next slide, please, Brecht. So this was a survey of 1,619 journals and focus group interviews. And they discovered that there is most likely an archipelago of 17,000 to 29,000 journals in open access, 11,500 of which are in the directory of open access journals. So at least 11,500 of them are relatively well known. Now, most often, I mean, one of the myths about open access is that these diamond journals are a feature, an exclusive feature of social sciences and humanities. But actually what the study found is that of those 1,619 journals, only 60% are in social sciences and humanities, 17% in medicine, and 22% in science. Now, especially the number of 17% is, I think, interesting here, because Ulle said, I don't know this from my field. And that again goes to showing not so much that it doesn't exist, but that it isn't simply not visible, all right? That is, they exist in certain pockets, perhaps less well known or less moneyed parts of the medical field. At the same time, this very diverse set of journals out there provides for about 45% of open access journal publishing, which represents about 8 to 9% of the total publishing volume. If you compare that, for instance, with APC Gold, that is compared very favorably. So perhaps it is invisible, but it accounts for a good chunk of academic publishing out there. And definitely, this is something that we want to pay attention to. The study also identified a number of challenges: technical capacity, management, visibility, and sustainability. As I already said, very often these are small journals without access to money, without access to proper governance or technical capacity. So those were the main challenges that were identified in the study. And the main recommendation of the study was that there should be more dialogue and commitment, more dialogue between researchers, research funding organizations, and performing organizations, university libraries, presses, departments, scholarly societies, and ministries, in order to make this sector of academic publishing more sustainable and more attractive to authors. And as a follow-up to this study, we designed the action plan for diamond open access that Brecht is going to talk about now. So I hand over the floor to Brecht immediately.
Yes, thank you, Johan. So hello, everyone. My name is Brecht Sanen. I'm Senior Policy Officer at Science Europe. And indeed, I'll be taking over because that last year, when this study was published that Johan just introduced, we suddenly found ourselves in a situation where this study, which I do think is a landmark study, had uncovered that largely invisible but very thriving ecosystem of diamond open access. And then we started, between the organizations that are behind this, started to talk about what is the next step in this process. If there's a process to strengthen this ecosystem, what do we do next based on this study, with very good findings and a very clear recommendation for more dialogue commitment between the different stakeholders. And what we came up with, and what we have launched earlier this year, earlier this month even, is the action plan for Diamond Open Access. The action plan is very clear. We want to substantially increase the capacity of Diamond journals and platforms to provide innovative, valid, reliable, and accessible publishing services. It is the next step in this process that was started with the findings of the study. And the action plan was prepared by my own organization, Science Europe, together with Coalition S, OPRAS, and the French National Research Agency, ANR, based on the findings of the study. But we did not want to do this by ourselves. We did not want to have a top-down process. We wanted this to be stakeholder-driven. So earlier this year, in the 2nd of February, we had a workshop with our own member organizations and the international experts from the community to discuss a first draft of the action plan based on the study and get their take and feedback. Now, I'm going to return to this last point on this slide, that this action plan has now been launched based on that initial feedback. It's been very successful, and it's open for endorsement to any organization or individual who would want to endorse it. But I'll come back to that in just a minute. First, I'd like to talk about, if I can move forward the slide, just about the central elements in this action plan. The central elements quite clearly are efficiency, quality standards, capacity building, and sustainability, based again on the findings of the study. Those are the main elements this action plan says that is where we think action is needed to strengthen the ecosystem in the longer term, and really build up this ecosystem to what it already does well, but can do even better. And the priority objectives are those 4, as you see. But then very important to notice here, to highlight here, is that the focus is on alignment and building common resources for Diamond Open Access, journals, platforms, the whole ecosystem. We want to build a framework in which those journals and platforms that already exist can do the work that they're doing and do it better, and have more means to do their work. But that focus on alignment and building common resources is very important to point out there in the action plan, is that this is something that we want to happen with respect for the cultural, multilingual, and disciplinary diversity that is one of the main strengths of Diamond Open Access. This is not about taking this ecosystem that is thriving and putting it all in the same mold. There are very different ways of approaching it that are working very well. And we want, with respect to that diversity, which we really think is a strength, to just add on a couple of things where we think, well, if we coordinate here, if we add some common resources here, we can have that diversity thrive even further. So this is an action plan not to put everything into the same mold, but have respect for the existing diversity. Now, these elements in the next couple of slides, and I'm just going to go through them. We have, if these slides are shared afterwards, I've just put them on here, but you can also find them in the action plan, all the things we have planned on each of those elements. But for this brief introduction, I'm just going to go ahead and skip all of this and get to my last slide, which is the process continues. This process has now taken the next step with the launch of the action plan. But the action plan is going to be taken further. Now, initially, I'm very happy to announce, which is relatively new, this news, is that we've been awarded with a large consortium of other project partners, a Horizon Europe project, the Diamas project that will start in September of this year. And this is a project that will allow us to take many of the actions within the action plan further. So a lot of the activities and events that we would need to develop and implement the action plan in the coming years will be under the umbrella of this project initially. And then at the same time, the interested organizations and individuals, as I said, that are thinking of and willing to endorse this action plan and join that community, that is possible. This is right now open for anyone to endorse. And a couple of notes there is that endorsement does not entail any financial commitment. You will see in the action plan, there are some actions that do talk about the need for investments at some point, but endorsing the action plan is not a financial commitment. What endorsement means is that your organization or you as an individual subscribe to this community, subscribe to the action plan, the vision that speaks out of it, and the course forward that speaks out of it. That is what you are endorsing. Endorsing organizations and people, those are publicly listed on the website, and you see there the website where you can go to consider endorsing. And also good to announce here is that as we build this action plan under the umbrella of the DMAS project that will start in September, we are going to be consulting with endorsing organizations and individuals. We will bring them together in webinars and other events to have their take on how this process should ideally take shape. So if you're interested in joining that, then that is possible. I'm just going to leave it there. There's a questions slide here, but I'll give it back to Ole then.
Okay, thank you very much indeed to both Johann and Brecht for this interesting presentation. And we then move on to Professor Sarah de Rijke, who is the Scientific Director at the Center for Science and Technology Studies at Leiden University. So please, Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I want to take as a starting point that the action plan from Science Europe and from Coalition S and OPROS and the ANR is very laudable and should really receive broad support. And what I would like to do in these 5 minutes is to place this initiative in the larger context of the transition to open science in general, and also how it's playing out globally. And in particular, also the link to research cultures and research assessment and research assessment reform that is absolutely crucial to move toward Diamond Open Access, and perhaps also even beyond Diamond Open Access. I want to do that by highlighting relevant elements of the UNESCO recommendation on open science that was adopted last November. And I think that recommendation does a really excellent job to position the debates and also the initiatives about open access publishing in the broader context of an open and more inclusive, transparent and equitable research culture for the benefits of science, but also for larger society. A couple of years ago, the almost 200 member states tasked UNESCO with developing this international standard setting instrument on open science in the form of a recommendation. And a recommendation by UNESCO is a legal instrument that is really intended to influence the development of national laws and practices. And with 3 colleagues, I was a representative of the Western European and North American states, and in that capacity I also contributed to writing the recommendation. And in the recommendation we have here on the slide also our operationalization of the term open science as a broad and inclusive term, combining various movements and practices aimed at making scientific knowledge openly available, accessible and reusable for everyone, to increase collaborations and information sharing, to open the processes of knowledge creation, evaluation and communication to societal actors beyond the traditional scientific community. And it also includes all disciplines and aspects of scholarly practices, including basic and applied sciences, natural and social sciences, and the humanities. And in the recommendation, we've outlined 4 key pillars. One is open scientific knowledge, which is here in green on top. Open science infrastructures in purple on the right, open engagement of societal actors in orange on the bottom, and open dialogue with other knowledge systems in blue on the left. The recommendation states that access to scientific knowledge should be as open as possible, and that access restrictions need to be proportionate and also justified, which we think can only be justifiable in a couple of instances. So for instance, when human rights need to be protected, or when there's an issue of national security, or when the right to privacy and also respect for human subjects of study, or sacred and secret indigenous knowledge applies. So why do we need a global initiative like this UNESCO recommendation? Well, it's a very important reason, the fact that we need to break the barriers in the way we assess researchers, which is now tightly coupled to quite classic forms of publishing in high impact international English language journals. We need to change the current research culture, and we need to reward researchers for sharing and for collaborating and engaging with society. The recommendation specifies that this is a combined effort by many different stakeholders, including funders, including universities, including societies, including journals across disciplines and also countries. We recommend to review research assessments and career evaluation systems in order to align them with the principles, the broad principles of open science that we've outlined. And we also recommend to promote the development and also implementation of evaluation and assessment systems that build on existing efforts to improve the ways in which scientific outputs are evaluated. You can think of this initiative that we've just heard of, DORA, the Leiden Manifesto. Initiatives that promote evaluation systems that give value to all research activities and scientific outputs, that take into account evidence of impact and also of knowledge exchange, and that take into account this diversity of disciplines that I mentioned, and also different career stages, with particular attention to researchers at the beginning of their careers. The recommendation further says that member states should ensure that the practice of open science is a known and well understood and also standardized element in academic recruitment and promotion criteria, and that all stakeholders are encouraged to adopt policies that require and also reward open access to scientific knowledge. And thirdly, and that was really crucial for the discussion of today, that we ensure diversity in scholarly communications by following the principles of open, transparent, and equitable access, and by supporting non-commercial and collaborative publishing models with no article or book processing charges. So I'd like to conclude with this. One of UNESCO's core values is equity, alongside fairness and also diversity and inclusion. And in many cases, open science does foster equity, but not all the time, and not ironically for everyone. So this is, for instance, the case because open access publication fees create new unintended barriers to authorship that can lead to a two-tier system in which richer research teams publish more open access articles in the most prestigious journals. Well, that is what we all try to avoid, obviously. So you could argue that we need a new transition. So after the mainstreaming of the transition from open access to open science, we might need a new transition from open science to open and equitable science. And that might also even include a more radical shift in focus from the topic of today, diamond open access, which still fits squarely within the context of traditional journal publishing, to even more open forms of publishing and peer review, including, for instance, publishing reviews and publishing reviews on preprints. And this is something that my colleague Luda Waldman is working on at CWTS with partners. So thank you. The floor is yours, Professor Verbeek, I think. I think you're still on mute, Ole.
Sorry, yeah, thank you very much. So we move on very quickly to Professor Demi Verbeek, Professor and Head of KU Leuven Library, and talking about the role of libraries in supporting diamond open access. So Demi, please, the floor is yours.
I first want to reassure people you're not seeing my slide, not because there's something wrong, but because I simply do not have slides.
Okay.
So my contribution highlights the role that academic libraries can play in the context of Diamond Open Access. And personally, I am convinced that libraries have a responsibility in this field on at least two levels. First, in creating awareness that such a thing as Diamond Open Access exists, contributing to the understanding of what it is exactly, and perhaps even going further by promoting it as a preferred route towards open access. And second, I believe that libraries have a responsibility to fund Diamond Open Access initiatives and thus play a crucial role in ensuring the sustainability of these initiatives. Let us look at the first responsibility. For more than a decade now, academic libraries worldwide have played a role in promoting open access, explaining the various options to make academic work freely available to all, highlighting the pros and cons of the various routes towards open access, etc. This advocacy work is lately more and more interwoven with talking about funder compliance or talking about things like block grants, open access funds, and read and publish deals. However, we need to be very careful that the latter does not turn us into salesmen for the publishers with whom we have this kind of agreements. The thing that we always need to remember, in my opinion, is that academic librarians do not work for publishers. They work for their universities and serve the scholarly community. So they need to talk about the diversity of open access possibilities and owe it to their profession to provide an analysis, which is as objective as possible, of the pros and cons of various open access approaches so that their universities and researchers can make up their own mind. In that context, it is important that librarians also talk about Diamond Open Access and always give the full picture. For instance, by not only talking about the main thing that scholars associate with Diamond Open Access, namely that this is an approach to scholarly publishing which does not charge fees to either authors or readers, but also to stress the second element of the characterization used in the recent action plan for Diamond Open Access, namely that these are community-driven, academic-led, and academic-owned publishing initiatives. And this is important because this makes an essential difference in the financial model behind initiatives of this sort, and is the reason why I am convinced that scholars, funders, institutions, and libraries should not only foster Diamond Open Access, but should even prioritize it over other approaches. Now on to the second responsibility of libraries, which I see, namely that they not only talk and inform about Diamond Open Access, but maybe even promote it, but also literally put their money where their mouth is and financially support Diamond Open Access programs. With all due respect to my fellow librarians, but I have very little patience for the argument we do not have the budget to support Diamond Open Access programs. Most university libraries in the Western world have multi-million budgets, whether they receive additional block grants for open access or not. Don't come and tell me you can't find a few grand in that budget for Diamond Open Access. I do, however, understand and sympathize completely with the realization that we need to rethink our budgets in order to make room for Diamond Open Access. Both acquisition and cataloging processes of libraries are still completely geared towards either the traditional model of publishing behind a paywall or to its publishers who have found a way to shape their open access offer in such a way that it almost appears as business as usual for libraries, for instance through read and publish deals. As a result, there is a big risk that library budgets are completely hoovered up by a combination of buying paywalled content and spending money on the privately owned for-profit approach to open access. And this means that if we want to financially support Diamond Open Access, we need to either prioritize it in the sense that we first spend our budget on Diamond Open Access, then on paywalled content, then on for-profit open access, or that we need to make much clearer distinctions in our budgets and need to separate a percentage for Diamond Open Access, a percentage for paywalled content, and a percentage for-profit OA. The other task, of course, is that we also need to stick to that division. If the price tag of either of these three categories increases, and by the way, I guarantee you that the price tag for-profit open access will increase, then you cannot move around money from one category to the other without first having the thorough discussion that this implies a policy change. I wish to conclude my short intervention by stressing that I consider both the responsibilities for libraries in the context of Diamond Open Access I have talked about, namely advising about it and financially supporting it, I consider them as an obvious continuation of the role academic libraries have been playing in the field of scholarly communication for generations. Libraries are not in the business of telling researchers what to do and how to distribute the results of their work. But that does not cancel out the fact that researchers turn to libraries for guidance in this, either by making explicit appeals to the expertise within libraries to provide support and advice, or implicitly by observing which choices academic libraries make in their collection building and adapting, consciously or subconsciously, their own publishing practices to it. Similarly, research libraries have a long tradition of funding the market for academic publishing. Library budgets pay for the acquisition of monographs, standing orders for series, and for subscriptions to journals and databases. So it is natural that these same libraries are now called upon to act as funders for publishing in open access. And just like libraries were entrusted to make wise budget choices in a traditional system of acquisition of content behind the paywall, they should now be entrusted to make wise budget choices in how to support open access publishing. And I, for one, am convinced that we will ensure much better value for our money and thus do a much better job for our institutions and researchers if we favor academic-led approaches towards open access without author fees over for-profit approaches towards open access focused on individual publications. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And in the interest of time, we move quickly to Professor Thomas Susi from the University of Vienna, Open Research Europe. Please, Thomas.
Yes, thank you very much. So I'll just skip the introductions in the interest of time and just to say that I'm an active researcher myself who has personal experience with 2 open access venues. And the first of these is the Biostein Journal of Nanotechnology. It's published by the Biostein Institute in Germany, and they get their money basically for a long time now by having a database of organic chemistry. And this has allowed them to use that funding to pay for these diamond initiatives. There's a Biostein Journal of Organic Chemistry, and then the Biostein Journal of Nanotechnology, which I've published in. And yeah, the research article here at the top from 2014 is my 10th most cited publication out of a total about 80. So it's gotten quite a nice number of citations, even though it is a relatively niche topic. And my most cited publication is actually the review article that I published with them. And that's gotten, again, from a relatively niche topic, has gotten quite a few citations. And I would especially say that having review articles be openly available is a great benefit, because then they're accessible for the most people who look for them. In addition, as mentioned, I'm both on the Scientific Advisory Board of Open Research Europe, which is a publishing platform by the European Commission. And they have an innovative model whereby they kind of combine the best benefits of preprints and peer review into one place. So you first submit your manuscript that gets openly shared after some editorial checks, kind of as a preprint, but then it undergoes open peer review on the platform itself, and then becomes an accepted article that then gets indexed in all the bibliometric databases and so on. And they support basically all forms of open science that one could think of: open data, open code, these open peer reviews. And so they're a very innovative platform. And I also personally published an article there, which is a software tool article from my ERC project. And it describes a code for simulating transmission electron microscopy. It went this open peer review and got quite a lot of very positive feedback from the community. It's getting taken up quite a lot already. And the really nice thing with this article type is that when we update the code, we can just publish revisions of the article, and then the description of these new features are going to be openly available. So what's the rub? I mean, this all sounds wonderful, very modern features, good citations. So what's the problem? I would summarize the problem with one word, which is prestige. And the fact is that careers of especially early career researchers are still very much held hostage to the prestige of journal brands. And we don't really have freedom to choose where we publish, at least not all of our work. Like, I could not have gotten a career if I had published all my work in Biostein Journal of Nanotechnology. I don't think so, because we are still so captivated by these journal brands and this prestige of certain outlets. And that means we have to change the research assessment, which Sarah also alluded to already. But I would personally very strongly believe that it's not up to individuals to make choices that go against their career interest, especially not young folks. They don't need to become martyrs for some sort of an open science ideals. We need a systemic reform of the entire research assessment system. And to this end, I've worked with the Initiative for Science in Europe, and we are very focused on bringing the researcher perspective to the fore. Researchers are the ones that very often do the assessment and very often the ones that are being assessed. So the researcher views are very important in figuring out how should we assess research and researchers when we get away from this prestige game of impact factors, and also enable, by this reform, enable us to focus and support good things like open science, but also diamond open access venues, which may not yet have the prestige that established commercially owned publication venues have. And we have a report out just a couple of weeks ago where we really highlight the importance of research abuse in this reform. And I very much applaud the efforts by the European Commission, the European University Association, Science Europe, and many other stakeholders, because they are really engaging with researchers and researchers organizations in getting our feedback and our views on how to change things together. And there's a lot of momentum going on, and I really am quite hopeful that we can achieve some real change. And after that, Diamond Open Access journals, they can really hopefully be able to compete on their actual services. They provide a very good service, and when we decouple that service from the prestige that they need to compete against, I think that will unlock a lot of innovation in the publishing field. So that's all I wanted to cover. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Toma. If we can, yeah, so now we have the whole panel here. So you can unmute yourself, I think, because that will enable more quick, short remarks perhaps to come in. It looks to me, also from looking at the Q&A, and some of the questions have already been partially answered, I can see from the responses, that there are two areas, I think, which maybe we should focus on. I mean, there are two interesting areas. And the one is, of course, the fact that it does cost money to publish, maybe not as much as some people think, but it does cost money. And so money has to come from somewhere. So that's the first issue, first problem as I see it in diamond publishing. The other issue that is very clear is obviously that of the link to research assessment. And maybe that is the most serious one. So maybe we should take that up first, and that's also reflected in virtually all the questions that have come in, actually, although they're formulated in various different ways, but all of them to some extent come into this, how to accelerate the process. And that means essentially how to change the assessment system. As I see it historically, we have always, of course, had a system, certainly in the biomedical life sciences, where some journals have been more prestigious than other ones. That actually precedes the whole impact factor thing. Maybe for the younger generation, that is not so clear, but there were always journals that were much more important than other ones, and that was part of the assessment. And I also noticed that Sarah de Rijke mentioned that in terms of quality criteria, evidence of impact and exchange was something that had to be taken into account. And that does, of course, in some ways also reflect the prestige of some of these things. So there is a little bit of a problem here, of course, in totally wanting to change the assessment system, because it's difficult to totally ditch what are actually maybe even century-long traditions. And there is inevitably some respect for organizations and publication venues that have stood the test of time. So I would like actually to have a quick reaction from the panel to this, because it seems to me that that is at the heart of all the questions that have come in. And so how do we deal with that? So just some short interventions, please. We can start with Toma. This is top left on my screen.
Yeah, thank you. So I think we have to be careful to separate impact factor based quantities that people look at and rank journals based on a number from real reputation. Those are two very different things.
Yeah,
in physics, we have physical review letters, which has an impact factor of, I don't remember, I don't look at it anymore, 9, say. And a publication in physical review letters is one of the most important things that a person can do for their career. And it's not about the impact factor as a numeric value, it's about the reputation of the journal. The impact factors, when we boil that all down into a single number, then all sorts of gaming happens, and these numbers get adjusted and negotiated. And then we can have a journal that was founded, let's say, 4 years ago and gotten a lot of hype and good adjustments. And suddenly its number says it's better than physical review letters. And that is the system that we need to get away from. Nobody is really suggesting that we can't think of tradition and actually community journals that are important for a community. I don't think anybody is wanting to do that, because that would be obviously impossible.
Okay, Sarah, can you make a comment? Because you made this point actually also about evidence of impact and exchange.
Yeah, I guess one of the additional points to make, in addition to what Thomas just said, which I agree with, is that the goals of research are broader than journal publishing, and the types of work we do are also broader. So even if you don't talk about impact, but within the context of doing research, the goals can be broader than producing journal-based outputs. Then there's the issue of, so of course you're right, that there have always been journals and some have stood the test of time. But what we see with the increasingly web-based way of working, and in combination with the rise of commercial data providers, is that we have accelerated this way of working around a very specific metric and a very specific research infrastructure that has created what we often refer to as a streetlight effect. So that has really consequences for the focus of the work, and it narrows the scope of what we consider to be a relevant question in the first place, when we already envision what type of impact in a number a particular project or article could have from the inception phase of doing the work. And that has been established in research, that is what the unintended effects of GIF-based work and evaluation can have. So that is quite a fundamental change of the way we do science, which is very problematic, I think.
Okay, Johann, would you like to comment on these questions?
Yes, I think, I mean, there's a reason why we have Principle 10 in Plan S, which focuses on doing away with classical prestige, at least. Of course, there will always be prestige, but it should be based on the content and the quality of the articles themselves, not on purely quantitative metrics. So that's one first thing. The funders have also committed to no longer use journal impact factors and those kind of factors for selecting grants. So that, I think, is an important step. Of course, universities should also get into the game, and that is part of the EC initiative, recent EC initiative, to make DORA more of an issue on the ground. Namely, I mean, I truly believe that DORA and the changing of evaluation systems will only become a reality as soon as we have annual evaluation forms on the ground that can be used by supervisor and employees, you know, and then incorporate these new ways of looking at evaluations. In terms of I think you also mentioned sustainability. I think sustainability indeed for diamond journals is an issue in terms of financial sustainability. That is something that we will look at within the project. We will try to set up a system also via Diamond Journal Capacity Center that will organize these funding streams and make sure that the journals receive what they need. It doesn't need to cost much. For instance, I run a journal called Glossa, a journal of linguistics, and we ask, we of course are covered by the Open Library of Humanities, but we ask authors who have the means to contribute a sum of 500 euros, which is really not too much. And we do find that about half our authors are able to find that sum in their funding or from their department, which is of course a very different proposition from the 10,000 you mentioned earlier, Ola. So, you know, a new world is possible. Let's make it.
Okay, Demi?
Yeah, I don't know whether I have that much to ask. Maybe from the book side perspective, one thing that I always have ask my students is to question prestige. It's perfectly okay to ask academics to think about tradition and to question tradition. And for instance, you can't have bachelor students make this exercise, but master students or PhD students compare two books. A book edited by or published with Oxford University Press and a book published by open book publishers, and compare what it costs, compare the various formats of ebooks, real life impact, what sort of author contracts do they have, what is the licensing, and then make up your mind which one of the two does the better job for the scholar, for scholarship, and have them think about what is certain types of prestige, are they warranted or not in publishing. And then you can sometimes see light bulbs appearing on top of their head, like, oh, wait a minute, yes, maybe we should question this.
Okay, Brecht?
Yes, I can only agree with my fellow panelists. I'm very happy that, as Sarah started this, that context of the broader research culture and research assessment reform, to bring that in here as well, because it is that culture, and I think that excessive focus on so the journal impact factor and all that these very excessive APC costs then are only possible because of that culture. You know, that is ultimately what it is based on. And this is something, in addition maybe to all the good points that my fellow panelists have said, I think there is one reason in my mind to take this very, very seriously, is because last year I was involved with a Europe-wide survey of the European universities at the European University Association. And just one example I want to give there is surprisingly, we had asked the universities, what incentives do you provide for open science? Just no qualifications. That was an open question. What incentives do you give? And we were sort of expecting, you know, training courses, training, all kinds of things. But ultimately, I think it was more than half of the responses in one way or another were about APCs and sort of we pay for the APCs, or we cannot pay APCs even, you know. Some universities said we have a budget, we pay for that. Other universities with a lower budget said, well, we can't pay that, so we actually don't have any incentives. That equation that is developing in people's minds in this community of, you know, if it's open access, that's costly, that's APCs, that equation is something that is developing, is what I'm getting from that result. And that is something then where Diamond Open Access, I think, has a big role to play, to show that is not necessarily how we're going to achieve open access. It should not be an added cost. Not necessarily an added cost. And I think I'm going to leave it at that.
No, it's not necessarily an added cost, but there's still the question that there is a cost. And it seems also to me that there could be considerably different costs in different areas. I mean, obviously in the humanities, in scholarly research, mostly, but not always. There are not that many figures and illustrations, and probably not dynamic images and so on, which are necessary in some parts of science. So I would imagine, without being an expert in that area, that there could be very considerably different costs, let's say in the life science area as one extreme, compared to, for example, papers in humanities. And so the money has to come from somewhere. I think we all agree on that. It's the journals that have been signposted in this conversation clearly have managed in various ways to get this funding done. But as I understand it, and maybe some of you can comment on that, a number of these diamond journals rely to a large extent on volunteers. So that it's not necessarily money, but there are various people who are happy to help out from universities and so on. And the question is, how sustainable is that? And of course, one very big question, yes, I will give you the words in 2 seconds, Johann. The big question for all of us as individuals when we decide where to send our papers is, of course, I mean, is this journal actually going to be around in a few years' time or not? You don't particularly want to send your paper to a journal which you think sort of depends perhaps on some volunteers and so on. So, Johann, how would you react to that?
Yes, I would react in the following way. I mean, many journals actually also with commercial publishers also depend on volunteer work. I mean, I know this is not the case in medicine, but then of course we know that in medicine there's more money than in other fields. And their editors are very often compensated handsomely for their work, for the big journals. That is not the case in social sciences and humanities, and it's not the case in many other fields. For instance, when I worked for Elsevier, I got some compensation yearly, but it was comparatively little. I always joked that, you know, if I wanted to make money with my for the work that I did in Elsevier, I would be much better off going to clean windows in my free time. So that was also an incentive for me to flip the journal from Elsevier, or at least the journal community, from Elsevier to an open access journal. So that is actually also an answer to some of the questions. How do you make sure that prestige is maintained? Well, one of the things you can do is to flip an existing subscription journal to Diamond Open Access. I did it, and if I can do it, I always say many other people can do it too. I mean, I don't have a magic touch or anything. It's something that is entirely feasible. And what you will find is that your community of authors, reviewers, and editors will follow you, and so you create instant prestige in the diamond sector. So I do think that volunteering work already exists also in the commercial sector. So I don't think that is the big problem. The big problem really is, as you suggest, namely, how do you make sure that the governance of these journals and the continuity of these journals is assured in the long term, independently of the individuals who run these journals. And of course there the commercial sector has much more of an advantage on us, because the fact that they are commercial entities ensures the continuity. So what we need to do in Diamond is to create a scholar-led, academic-owned initiative that is global and that makes sure that this continuity is assured in the long term.
Brecht?
I just wanted to add here, and obviously fully agree with Johann, but one thing I wanted to add and make explicit here maybe about his reply is that anytime we talk about Diamond Open Access and sort of the many issues and challenges and what this action plan is trying to do, one thing to always keep in mind is then to also have a look, as Johann did, what is the current system like? Is the current system better at this? And that goes for everything. Like beforehand, we have also talked about the need for investments, where is the money going to come from? My response there immediately would then also be, well, look at the current system and all the money that goes into that. And are we getting a return on investment that we as a community are happy with? So just to make that explicit, I think that most of these questions and that we have to deal with, like we are working on this to strengthen the Diamond Open Access ecosystem, in the back of our minds should also always be like, well, what is the current system like? It's not that we have to, I've lost my thread here, but you know what I'm saying.
Sarah?
Yeah, also adding on to the excellent comments by my fellow panelists, I think you raised two interesting issues, one around the sustainability of journals and one around volunteer work, and they're related, but I just wanted to disentangle them. So the comments have been also about the sustainability of journals and journal infrastructures, and yeah, it would be fantastic if we have more global scholar-led journal-based systems with scholar-led governance and continuity. There's also something to be said around making more visible the invisible and also volunteer work that happens in all these models. So the point around open peer review, around existing journals and journal publishing, but also the move to preprint publishing and preprint publishing in relatively stable web-based infrastructures or at university libraries. and organizing peer review around that and making those reviews visible and openly available would also, I think, help in this dynamic around volunteer work and recognizing and rewarding that type of activity as well.
Thank you. Demi?
Yeah, I just wanted to add concerning the financial sustainability of Diamond Open Access journals that I strongly believe in collective funding programs. Again, it's something that libraries have been doing for generations. We collectively funded journals by getting subscriptions. And now, instead of paying each €1,000 for a subscription to a paywalled journal, why don't we pay the same €1,000 to publish that journal in open access? For me, that is a no-brainer that we can do that as a library, considering that it's academic-led and that we are back in control, that the academic community is still in control. We're not going to collectively fund profit margins. And the element there is you not only need to have publishers willing to do that, you need to have libraries willing to fund, and you need to have somebody in between to bring them together. And I'm actually quite optimistic in that because, for instance, Lyrasis with the Open Access Community Investment Program is doing that, just is moving in that space. I hope, and I think probably the capacity center that is mentioned in the action plan is going to do something similar, bringing together libraries and journals to have Diamond, to fund Diamond Open Access. So I'm quite optimistic, and I see a lot of potential in collective funding programs to provide financial sustainability to Diamond Open Access.
There are a number of specific questions that relate to the question of how to accelerate the process towards Diamond. And one person asked what the panel might think about, should funders decide only to accept, shall we say, reports or papers that have been published in Diamond Open Access Journal when they are assessing applications or progress reports from journals? I mean, do you think that is a realistic way forward? Very quick answers, because we are sort of in the last minutes of the webinar. So would anyone support such a move, for example, which is of course quite a drastic one, and probably, I would think in my own experience, not realistic, it's not going to happen, but the question is still whether should one push this idea. I see Thomas is shaking his head.
I would say that, like, I can see there being room to push for more funding to be directed at Diamond initiatives rather than commercial publishers. But I don't think funders refusing to review non-Diamond venues, I don't think that's a way to go, because it puts the pressure on authors, and that's not where we wanna, that's not where the biggest leverage is in the system.
Yeah. And then there's a specific question about Diamond book publishing. To what extent is that happening, and to what extent do you see that this could sort of change that? The book world, I guess, is traditionally a very commercial world, but is there a likely space for Diamond book publishing? Johann?
Yes, I would like to answer that. We have, in September 2021, we put out a policy for open access books, also because the EC and UKRI have put out a policy for Diamond books. The policy for that Coalition S has for Diamond books is slightly less ambitious than that for articles. So we still allow for embargoes there, also recognizing that the Diamond open access books is different from the journal market. So we allow for a little bit more time there for the transition. Just also to, because in the Diamond open access, in the open access books world, there's also a lot of small publishers who have not yet made that transition or are not yet thinking about that transition. So that is something that we want to give some time for. There is also a project that is being prepared for open access books funded by the European community that is going to go forward. That line is coming up soon, and I'm involved in that. That is also going to formulate recommendations for funders, for institutions, and so on, to move towards open access book. There, of course, in the books world, much more than in the journals world, we have the weight of tradition. you know, scholars in social sciences and humanities still like the physical book, so that they can give this physical hardcover book with a glossy cover to their grandmother for Christmas, right? Rather than have an open access book, which is purely digital, but which can be read from here to Kuala Lumpur. Of course, whether it's read in Kuala Lumpur is not something you can see, but it makes a much bigger impact. And this is something that we need to much more advertise towards scholars. That it's more important to publish digitally than to kill some trees.
Demi?
I just wanted to add that actually, just like you have for Diamond Open Access journals, you can have collective funding programs for Diamond Open Access books too. And you basically have two models: the backlist model that, for instance, Direct to Open of MIT Press does it, Fund to Mission of Michigan, where basically you buy, as a library, you buy a subscription to the backlist. With the money the publisher makes this way, they publish open access books without author fees. And then you just have collective funding programs for open access publishers who have always been open access, who do not have a backlist, and just like ask small amounts as sort of supporting that publisher. Punctum books work like that, open book publishers work like that, and they prove that it can be done. Just like the Open Library of Humanities proves that collective funding for journals works. So we just need more programs like that, I think.
We are ending very close to the end of it, but I would still like to kind of draw things together a little bit and maybe have some final reactions. It seems to me, and I may not be right, that ultimately, if diamond publishing is actually going to be really, shall we say, dominant in all areas, including the very large biomedical life science area where it has so far made very little impact, it seems to me that it will ultimately depend on large funding organizations like the research councils, European Research Council, actually being willing to put money into the system. So clearly, I mean, if a big organization like, for example, the European Research Council were to say, yes, we will fund journals in this way so that there's no need for article processing charges, then that would be possible. I find it difficult to imagine that without that kind of thing happening, that the really big funders in the US, obviously the NIH, in the UK, the research councils, etc., in Germany, the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, I feel that will be needed in order to solve that problem. There will always be clearly niche journals that can do it and can show that it's done, but I think in the huge area of biomedical, I have difficulty seeing that it will not happen if that is not the case. I mean, is that an outrageous statement, or people agree with that? Thomas?
You mentioned the European Research Council, and I don't personally think the ERC should put money in. ERC could put its reputation in. It could make a journal of the European Research Council, or have an area within Open Research Europe where ERC research is being published, and just putting their prestige and their ERC grantees as peer reviewers, that would be a huge impact without costing them anything. So I think there is, the European Commission is putting a lot of money on this. Science Europe is putting money on this. I think we need a lot more just people putting their attention, their prestige, the time they use to review, and just having these conversations that question the status quo and discuss the good alternatives that already exist.
It seems to me, if I can just make a counter to that, that at the moment, of course, certainly in the biomedical sector that I'm most familiar with, the fact is that people who have grants have money to pay APCs. And so the way to solve the problem in a kind of brutal way would obviously be to say that you cannot pay APCs from your grants, but that the funding organization instead put that money into the publishing world. That would be a kind of solution. Whether this is something that will happen or not is quite a different matter. But that seems to me that that would actually be the only way it could really be solved. Any other comments on this point, Sarah?
Yes. Well, in a way, Coalition S is already doing that, right? Because we are not allowing our funding to be used for hybrid journals. So journals that have both a subscription side and an open access side, unless those journals commit to flipping to open access. But that's commercial open access. I mean, in the ideal world of indeed, like you said, there would be funding redirected, rechanneled towards Diamond open access. I do think that will eventually, or that may eventually happen if we manage to set up a system that is that emanates trust. You know, that radiates trust. A system on a large scale, like the Open Library of Humanities, so that commercial journals and communities that have commercial journals can flip to Diamond open access. I also note that the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft has signed our Diamond open access plan, so I do hope that they will contribute towards this, so that is very important. And I also note that UKRI is a member of Coalition S and has mandated, for instance, open access books from 2024 going forward. So there are already a number of initiatives that really support this move towards a fully open access world, where, you know, money is being used towards more virtuous purposes than lining the pockets of shareholders of the commercial publishing.
Of course, in the biomedical world, of course, the big one is the US, of course, and you still have to.
Yeah, the US is still very much behind. I mean, in this effort, they really still rely a lot on green open access, so the sharing of
and particularly in the biomedical world, of course, where the US is a very, very dominant force. That's obviously
I couldn't agree more. I mean, we do talk to them on a regular basis, but yeah, it's still a long road.
Any other last minute comments? We are already 5 minutes into extra time, but there's as such no particular problem about it. So if anybody feel that I may not systematically, because there's still a lot of questions coming in, although many of them are kind of reiterations or comments on things we already have talked about. But if any of you have a quick comment to make on any, yes, Sarah?
Very quick. The Global Research Council just published end of last year a very interesting report after the symposium on responsible research assessment that they organized. And one of the things that was flagged there was the role of funders in fostering change. So we've been discussing funding and financial incentives that they can create, but obviously there's also something to do with the assessment criteria they use and implement, and how they foster more responsible research culture initiatives. So that entire package could be seen as linking together, and I think should be seen as linking together. And that Global Research Council initiatives outlines that very well.
Brecht?
Yeah, I just wanted to come in because, as you know, Science Europe, we represent quite a few research funding organizations in Europe. And the news is good from our side is that our members, we are engaged in this. We're curious, interested. We are involved not just with open science and Diamond open access. We also I have a colleague in the office working only on research culture and research assessment transformation. We do see this as a comprehensive shift. My final comment would be, again, as has been mentioned before by Thomas, also there is some care involved there. We cannot, for example, just all decide to only do Diamond open access all of a sudden. That would make life very difficult for individual researchers and research teams that are working in the current system still and are building their careers still in the current system. There is some care involved there. To take it back to the action plan from our side really is a way of saying there are valid questions that need to be answered that people have going into this. The action plan for us is a way of addressing those questions and really setting up a system that I think, as Johann said, is trustworthy, is solid, and where it's very clear where we can take steps forward. But that work needs to be done before we become very revolutionary, like some of the suggestions I heard before.
Yeah, I think Johann is right there. The trust, and you also is very important. As we all know, in all processes where you want to make change, there is a potential tipping point, and that depends on an increasing number of people actually believing that things are going to happen. And we probably haven't quite reached that tipping point yet, but it can happen suddenly that there is a consensus building. So I think we have to finish this webinar. I would like to give maybe Johann the last word as a champion from Coalition S, and just to kind of wrap up just 1 or 2 minutes, and then I think we are already beginning to see the numbers going down, but we have actually had 170, 180 people with us for most of the time, so it's been a very good attendance. So Johann, maybe the final word.
Yes, thank you, Ola. I would like to first thank every contributor here. I think it's been a very quick but very rich discussion. I mean, with various viewpoints all going in the same direction. I do hope, like that what you said will happen. That we have perhaps not reached the tipping point, but we have certainly put in motion a process that I believe will lead to a more equitable system for academic publishing than the one we are living in now. And I do think that the Diamond Action Plan can contribute to that, in combination, of course, with a new system for the evaluation of authors. I think those two elements are essential, but we have to build towards this better world for academics, I believe, and this is where I would like to leave it. Thank you very much.
Okay, so it just remains for me to, on behalf of these 3 organizations that have dealt with this webinar, to thank all of you, first of all the panelists, but also the many people who have been with us and who are still with us. We still have more than 100 people with us actually at this moment in time, which is very good. And in particular to thank Julie Davis, who has done a lot of the behind the scenes work for making this happen. So thank you very much indeed.